10 minutes later Dogger sat listening to Erdan singing, although that in itself wasn't the problem. It was a sound you could imagine floating across Sunset Tiger. Water dripped off the light fitting, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was Nicky. It usually was. He was going to meet her after work at the House of Tofu. He was horribly afraid that Erdan would come with him. This was not likely to be good news. His stock with Nicky was bumping on the bottom even before last night, owing to an ill-chosen remark about black stockings that week, when he was still on probation for what he said ought to be done with mime artists. Nicky liked new men, although the term was probably out of date now. Jesus, he'd taken up the Guardian to keep up with her, and even got another black mark when he said he liked its children's page read exactly like someone would write if they set out to do a spoof Guardian's children's page. Erdan wasn't a new man. She was bound to notice him. She had a sort of radar for things like that. He had to find a way to send him back. "I want to drink your blood," said Skung from behind the sofa. "Oh, shut up!" He tried some positive thinking again. "It's absolutely impossible that a fictional character I created is having a bath upstairs. It's hallucination caused by overwork. Of course I don't feel mad, but I wouldn't, would I? He's projection. That's right. I've been going through a bad patch lately, basically since I was about 10, and Erdan's just a projection of the sort of macho thingy I secretly wanted to be. Nicky said I wrote the books because of that. She said I can't cope with the real world, so I turned all the problems into monsters and invented a character that could handle them. Erdan is how I cope with the world. I never realized it myself, so all I need to do is be positive and he won't exist." He eyed the pile of manuscript on the table. "I wonder if Conan Doyle had this sort of problem. Perhaps he was just sitting down to tea when Sherlock Holmes knocked at the door, still dripping wet from Richthofen Falls or whatever, and then started hanging around the house making clever remarks until Doyle trapped him in the pages again." He half rose from his chair. "That was it. All he had to do was to rewrite the—" Erdan pushed open the door. "Ho!" he said, and stuck his relatively little, finger in one wet ear and made a noise like a cork coming out of a bottle. He was wearing a bath towel. Somehow he looked neat, less scared. Amazing what hot water could do, Dogger decided. "All my clothes, they prickle," he said cheerfully. "Did you try washing them?" said Dogger weakly. "They all dry all solid like wood," said Erdan. "I pray for clothes like God's, mighty Kevin." "None of mine would fit," said Dogger. He looked at Erdan's shoulders. "None of mine would half fit." He added, "Anyway, you're not going anywhere. I give in. I'll rewrite the last chapter. You can go home." He beamed. This is exactly the right way. By taking the madness seriously, he could make it consume itself. All he need do was change the last page. He didn't even need to write another Erdan book. All he needed to do was make it clear that Erdan was still alive somewhere. "I'll write you some new clothes, too," he said. "Silly, isn't it?" he went on. "A big lad like you dying in an avalanche. You've survived much worse." He pulled the manuscript towards him. "I mean," he burbled happily, "don't you remember when you had to cross the Gribor Desert without water and you—" A hand like iron closed over his wrist. Gently, but firmly. Dogger remembered one of those science films which had showed an industrial robot capable of putting 2 tons of pressure on a point 1/8 of an inch across, gently picking up an egg. Now his wrist knew how the egg felt. "I like it here," said Erdan. He made him leave Skung behind. Skung was a sword of few words, and none of them would go down well in a whole food restaurant where even the bean sprouts were free range. Erdan wasn't going to be left behind, though. Where does a 7-foot barbarian hero go, Dogger thought? Wherever he likes. He also tried writing Erdan a new suit of clothes. It was only partially successful. Erdan was not cut out by nature by him to wear a sports jacket. He ended up looking as Dogger had always pictured him, like a large and over-enthusiastic Motorhead fan. Erdan seemed becoming more obvious. Maybe whatever kind of mental antibodies prevented people from seeing him wore away after a while. He certainly got a few odd looks. "Who is Tofu?" said Erdan as he walked to the bus stop. "Ah, not a who, an it. It's a sort of food, and tiling grout combined. It's it's something like, well, sometimes it's green, other times it isn't," said Dogger. This didn't help much. "Well," he said, "remember when you went to a fight for help at the Dodge of Tenity? I'm pretty sure I wrote you eating pasta." "Yes." "Compared to tofu, pasta is a taste explosion. 2 to the center, please," Dogger added to the conductor. The man squinted at Erdan. "Rock concert on, is there?" he said. "And you carouse in this tofu?" said Erdan as they alighted. "Well, you don't carouse organically. My girl, a young lady I know, works there. She believes in things. And look, I don't want you spoiling it, okay? My romantic life isn't exactly straightforward at the moment." A thought struck him. "And don't let's have any advice from you about how to straighten it. Throwing women over your pommel and riding off into the night isn't approved of around here. It's probably an ism," he added gloomily. "It works for me," said Erdan. "Yes," muttered Dogger. "It always did. Funny that. You never had any trouble. I sort about. 26 books without a change of clothes, and no girl ever said she was washing her hair." "Not my fault. They just throw—" "I'm not saying it was. I'm saying a chap has only got so much of it, and I gave mine to you." Erdan's brow wrinkled mightily with the effort of thought. His lips moved as he repeated the sentence to himself once or twice, and then he appeared to reach a conclusion. "What?" he said. "And you go back in the morning?" "I like it here. You have picture television, sweet food, soft seats. You enjoyed it in Chimera. The snowfields, the bracing wind, the endless taiga." Erdan gave him a sidelong glance. "Didn't you?" said Dogger, uncertainly. "If you say so," said Erdan. "And you watch too much far-seeing box." "Television," corrected Erdan. "Can I take it back?" "What, to Chimera? It gets lonely on the endless taiga between books." "You found the Channel 4 button, I see." Dogger turned the idea over his mind. It had a certain charm. Erdan the barbarian with his blood-drinking sword, chainmail kilt, portable television and thermal blanket. No, it wouldn't work. It wasn't as if there were many channels in Chimera, and probably one of the few things you couldn't buy in the mysterious souks of Ak-Telezel was a set of decent NICADs. He shivered. What was he thinking about? He was really going mad. The fans would kill him. And he knew he'd never be able to send Erdan back. Not now. Something had changed. He'd never be able to do it again. He'd enjoyed creating Chimera. He only had to close his eyes and he could see the Shemark Mountains, every lofty peak trailing its pennant of snow. He knew the Prade's delta like the back of his hand. Better. And now it was all going, ebbing like the tide, leaving Erdan, who was evolving. "Here it say, House of Tofu," said Erdan, who had learned to read, whose clothes somehow looked less hairy, whose walk was less of a shamble. And Dogger knew that when they walked through that door, Erdan and Nicky would hit it off. She'd see 'em all right. She always seemed to look right through Dogger, but she'd see Erdan. His hair was shorter. His clothes looked merely stylish. Erdan had achieved in a short walk from the bus stop what it had taken most barbarians 10,000 years to accomplish. Logical, really, after all. Erdan was basically your total hero type. Put him in any environment and he'd change to fit. 2 hours with Nicky and he'd be torpedoing whaling ships and shutting down nuclear power stations single-handedly. "You go on in," he said. "Problems?" said Erdan. "Just got something to sort out. I'll join you later. Remember, though, I made you what you are." "Thank you," said Erdan. "Here's a spare key to the flat in case I'm not back. Get held up or something." Erdan took it gravely. "You go ahead. Don't worry. I won't send you back to Chimera." Erdan gave him a look which surprise was leavened with just a hint of amusement. "Chimera?" he said. The word processor clicked into life, and the monitor was without form and void, and darkness was upon the screen, with, of course, the exception of the beckoning flicker of the cursor. Dogger's hand moved through the face of the keyboard. It ought to work both ways. If belief was the engine of it all, it ought to be possible to hitch a ride if you really were mad enough to try it. Where to start? A short story would be enough, just to create the character. Chimera already existed, like a little bubble of fractal reality created by these 10 fingers. He began to type, hesitantly at first, then speeding up as the ideas began to crystallize. After a little while he opened the kitchen window. Behind him, in the darkness, the printer started up. The key turned in the lock. The cursor pulsed gently as the two of them came in, talked, made coffee, talked again in the body language, finding that they really have a lot in common. Words like holistic approach floated past its uncritical beacon. He's always doing things like this, she said. It's the drinking and smoking. It's not a healthy life. He doesn't know how to look after himself. Erdan paused. He found the printed output cascading down the table, and now he put down the short MS half-read. Outside a siren wailed. Dopplered closer, shut off. "I'm sorry?" he said. "I said he doesn't look after himself." "I think he may have to learn," he said. He picked up a pencil, regarded the end of it thoughtfully until the necessary skills clicked precisely in his head, and made a few insertions. The idiot hadn't even specified what kind of clothing he was wearing. "If you're really going to write first person, you might as well keep warm. It got damn cold out on the steps." "You've known him a long time, then?" "Years. You don't look like most of his friends. We were quite close at one time. I expect I'd better see to the place until he comes back." He penciled in, but the welcoming firelight of Skirling encampment showed through the freezing trees. The Skirlings were okay. They considered that crazy people were great shamans. Kevin would be all right there. Nicky stood up. "Well, I'd better be going," she said. The tone had pitch of her voice turned tumblers in his head. "You needn't," he said. "It's entirely up to you, of course." There was a long pause. She walked up behind him and looked over his shoulder, her manner a little awkward. "What's this?" she asked, in an attempt to turn the conversation away from its logical conclusion. "Just a story of his. I'd better mail it in the morning." "Oh, are you a writer too?" Erdan glanced at the word processor. Compared to the bronze halls of Merkel, it didn't look too fearsome. A whole new life was waiting for him. He could feel it. He could flow out into it, and change to suit. "Just breaking into it," he said. "I mean, I quite like Kevin," she said quickly. "He just never seemed to relate to the real world." She turned away to hide her embarrassment, and peered out of the window. "There's a lot of blue lights down on the railway line," she said. Erdan made a few more alterations. "Are there?" he said. "And there's people milling about." "Oh." Erdan changed the title to The Traveller of the Falcon Song. What was needed was more development. He could see that. He'd write about what he knew. After a thought, he added, "Book 1 in the Chronicles of Kevin the Bard Singer." It was the least he could do.